Welcome. This is Mishnah in Depth Nazir, part of Springsman et Drisha with Avie Walfish. This class is following Mishnah Yomi this is following the Mishnah Yomi cycle, currently up to Sotah, and is the fourth session. Today's class is a makeup session. This is being recorded for the benefit of people who will not be able to join us because of Chol HaMoed or because of Yontiv. And we are glad to have you here, whether you're watching live on Facebook, if you're on Zoom, or if you are watching this as a recording. If you are watching live, questions are always welcomed. You can ask questions in chat, either on Zoom or on Facebook, and I will be monitoring them and bring them to Rabbi Walfish's attention. And if you are watching this on the recording, you can always contact Drisha by email at inquiry@drisha.com, and I'm happy to forward along any questions. And Rabbi Avie, do you have an email that people can reach you at if they are watching this class on a recording and have, say, questions?
Yeah, for sure. You can send out my email. Everyone's invited to to correspond with me if they so choose.
All right. And I'm just going to post sources in the chats, both on Facebook and YouTube. And if you are watching this on the recording, this will also be available as well. And with that, I want to hand things over to you. And take care. Happy learning.
Okay, thank you, Kayla. I want to pick up with where we left off last week. We were looking at the end of Nazir chapter 3, at the very interesting little narrative about Helene Hamalka, queen of Adiabadne, and as we see at around the time of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, which would be 1st century CE. The story, it's a brief story, but it gives us both an interesting historical perspective and I think also an interesting insight into what the Mishnah is doing in Tractate Nazir. Her son, who we find elsewhere, he succeeded her as king, and he's sometimes referred to in the sources as well. Son went out to war, and she took a vow that if he comes back in peace, then I will be a Nazirah for 7 years. I think it's a very timely message for us, although I'm not sure that today people would want to vow to be a mother would want to vow to be a Nazirah for 7 years if her son comes back, but perhaps other kinds of Nadarim would be in order. It's something well known in biblical stories, and here we see a source for this in Chazal as well. Okay, so if he comes back in peace, I will be a Nazirah for 7 years. And her son came back, and she was a Nazirah for 7 years. But since she was in Chutz La'aretz, she was not. She was queen of a different kingdom. So she came to Israel, and then she was told to observe another 7 years, at the end of which she became Tmeah, okay, which, as we know, erases the Nazirut that has already been observed, and so she ended up observing 21 years of Nazirut, 7 in Chutz La'aretz, 7 failed years in Eretz Yisrael, and another 7 successful years in Eretz Yisrael. So this is to illustrate the idea that Beit Hillel's psak, that when you observe Nazirut in Chutz La'aretz, it counts as a Nazirut, but when you come to Eretz Yisrael, you've got to do it over again, because Chutz La'aretz is, at least on a rabbinic level, considered to be a contaminated land that defiles you, defilement of corpse defilement, and so you would need to have a do-over when you come to Eretz Yisrael. That's the halachic point that's brought here. But I think there's something here that goes beyond the halachic point and beyond the very interesting historical vignette. If we look at this idea, so one point which we noted at the end of last class is that this story sort of complement with an E, the different kinds of motivations for Nazirut that we had in the previous chapter, in chapter 2. Chapter 2 gave us various motivations, including avoiding drinking wine. That was in Perek Bet Mishnah Gimel, including if my wife bears me a son. Okay, so that's sort of Nazirut as thankfulness. So you have Nazirut as a way of fortifying your resolve to abstain from drinking wine. Nazirut as a way of thanking God for something that something that He bestows upon you. And we had in Mishnah Bet in chapter 2, Nazirut as a when a person is frustrated, okay, and he says, a person in modern English might say, well, I'll be darned if XYZ. Okay, so you can do that in the form of Nazirut. Okay, if this cow stands up, I'll be a Nazir. Okay, you're trying your darndest to get it up. It's again, sort of way of, God help me with this, but it's a different variation of it. There's more a sign of frustration or desperation, as opposed to the thankfulness, okay, the joy in Mishnah Zayin. And here we have Heleni Malka also as a kind of thanksgiving, but I think it's actually more of a prayer. Okay, please, God, please bring him home safely. And if he does, I will pay you back for it, as it were. Okay, so it's also a sign of gratitude, but it has a different emotional tone to it than if my wife bears me a son. The person there is not, like in dire straits. He's not desperate, okay, but he's just joyful. He wants to show, I will express my joy if this and this happens. Okay, so different forms of gratitude, different, I would say, emotional overtones or undertones, perhaps, to the gratitude. Okay, so that's another aspect of it. But I think there's something else. This, to take a vow, if my son comes back safely from the war, I will be a Nizirah. This reminds me very much of a biblical story. Any thoughts? We have a couple of participants who are invited to say if they're reminded of a biblical story. Correct. Okay, this is very reminiscent of the Yiftach story. Chaim, you seem to have some computer problems. Okay, you came out a bit garbled, but I pulled the Yiftach out of what you said, and that's the correct answer. But if you think about the Yiftach story is really an inversion of our story, or to be more accurate, our story is an inversion of the Yiftach story. In the Yiftach story, Yiftach takes a vow, if I come back safely, then I will offer the first one out of my door to greet me. I will offer that whatever to God. Okay, and maybe he thought it would be an animal. My wife Ruthie, who has written an article on that biblical story, thinks he had a pretty good idea it would be a human being. Okay, which means he was thinking in terms of human sacrifice. But of course, many of the commentators who say human sacrifice is anathema to the Torah think that offering her to God actually meant Nazirut. So it may have meant Nazirut if you accept that interpretation. If he seriously meant, whether it corresponds to Torah norms or not, if he seriously meant an actual offering, so let's remember that Nazirut is also is or can be a kind of person offering himself to God. Remember the story of the Nazir from the south, okay, with Shimon HaTzadik. The whole point of the Nazirut was to offer the hair to God, which can be seen as a symbolic self-sacrifice. So whether or not Yiftach literally meant Nazirut or actually meant human sacrifice, but Nazirut can very readily be seen as something akin to human sacrifice. So Yiftach is offering either Nazirut or something akin to Nazirut, namely human sacrifice, of some member of his household in return for his coming back home safely. Okay? Now notice in versions, there's a Hebrew term for this kind of a literary tool. It's called bavua, which literally means reflection or mirror image. Okay, it's a mirror image relationship. And I think it's very common in these kinds of mirror images is the inversion of male and female. Yiftach, the male, going out to battle and hopefully coming home safely, is vowing something that his daughter ends up fulfilling. Okay, and here the mother of the warrior, okay, is taking a vow that she herself will be a Nazirah if he comes back safely. So I think a very clear inversion, of that story.
How do you spell that?
What?
How do you-
Bavua?
Yeah.
Bet Vav Aleph Hey. Bavua. Bet Vav Aleph Hey. Which means reflection or mirror image. Now, this kind of oblique allusion to the Yiftach story takes its place along with Nazirim who have been explicitly mentioned in Tractate Nazir. Namely, we've already seen Shimshon in chapter 1. Okay, Shimshon has a whole style of Nazirut named after him. I mentioned that at the end of the tractate, Shimshon will reappear along with another Nazir, or at least the Midrash understands him to be a Nazir, Shmuel. Okay, and there was an oblique allusion to yet another person who the Midrash understands to be a Nazir. In chapter 1, one of the characteristics of the Nazir Olam in right at the beginning of chapter 1, Mishnah 2, one of his characteristics was that Hichbid Sa'aro Mekel Betar. When his hair gets heavy, he can take a haircut. We talked at the time about when is that? Is it perhaps every 12 months? Some think it's perhaps even every 30 days, which I think is unlikely, but every 12 months would make sense. And the term Hichbid Sa'aro is actually taken from a biblical story, the story of Avshalom.
Avshalom.
Avshalom, we don't know that Avshalom was a Nazir, but we do know that Avshalom would cut his hair when it became heavy. Hichbid Sa'aro, he would cut his hair. And we know that Avshalom took leave from David to go and fulfill his vow. So Chazal connected the dots and said Avshalom was actually a Nazir. And this term Hichbid Sa'aro in chapter 1 seems to be an oblique reference to Avshalom. Okay, we'll have a lot more to say about that when we get to Tractate Sotah, by the way. But okay, but let's leave that for when we get there. So we have two well-known Nazirim, well-known biblical figures, identified as Nazirim, who the Mishnah explicitly refers to, and another two possible cases of Nazirim that the Mishnah alludes to obliquely. Okay, case of Avshalom and the case of Yiftach, and we may note that at least three of those four figures are rather problematic biblical figures. Shmuel is the only one we can unequivocally give high grades to. Shimshon and Yiftach, although both of them were judges of Israel, both of them were flawed characters, to say the least, and Avshalom, we needn't bother mentioning, is hardly viewed in the Tanakh as a positive character. And so that also gives us something about what the Mishnah has to say about Nazir. That Nazir seems to be oriented more towards the negative than to the positive. Here again, we're reminded of Tractate Nidarim, where by and large the Mishnah seems to take a rather negative view of Nidarim by and large, although it may sometimes serve good purposes. More often than not, it's actually something negative. And there's one other aspect of this Mishnah that I think is important, but let's pick up on that when we get into the next chapter, chapter 4. Okay, chapter 4 we'll try to do fairly quickly, because this week we're really supposed to be on chapters 5 and 6. Okay, but there are a few points that I think are important to note. Okay, so the first is that the first Mishnayot in chapter 4 are very, very highly reminiscent of Tractate Nidarim. And as we've been going through Tractate Nazir, we've noted Tractate Nazir has a lot of affinity with Tractate Nidarim, which is the next, the immediately preceding tractate, and we saw the openings of the two tractates are virtually identical, but there are a lot of other connections, and the idea that one person says, I am a Nazir, and the other person says, me too. Okay, so me too in these halachic contexts is a concept of neder. Okay, the Hebrew term for this is hatpasa, from the word litpos. Okay, in other words, a neder is a way of saying this item or these items shall be treated like. Now, the original source is korban, from which the term konam stems, but then you can also extend it. Because I will treat this item as though it were a korban. I will refrain from getting benefit from it. Or I will make you treat it like a korban. It's my item, you may not get benefit from it. Okay, so the basic idea of a neder is that a neder is a kind of offshoot of something sacred, something often sacrificial, and it can also be extended. If I take a neder, someone else can take his neder based on mine and say, me too. Same thing he said, so I'm doing the same. And we see that Nazirut has a similar concept of hatpasa. Okay, so this is an extension of the laws of Nidarim. Now, very quickly, chapter 4 takes this idea and orients it in the direction of a husband and a wife. Okay, husband and a wife. If the husband says Hareini Nazir, and what about you? Okay. So now what's unique about husband and wife in the area of Hatpasa? What's unique is that it can affect Hafara. And once again, we're in Neder territory. Hafarat Nidarim was the main topic of the last two chapters of Nidarim. And those two chapters were in turn the most obvious reason why Tractate Nidarim is in Seder Nashim, because Nidarim have an impact on the relationships between couples, husband and wife, and between father and daughter. And now we see in chapter 4 the same concept of hafara and the same kind of family setting. And now let's remember again the story of Heleni Hamalka. Story of Heleni Hamalka, again, is a story of a mother taking a neder because of her son. So we're seeing a family setting for Nazirut. There, and in chapter 2 we also had, if my wife gives birth to a boy, I will be a Nazir. So in chapters 2 and 3, we see family settings as the occasion for Nazirut. And now in chapter 4, we're seeing the family setting of a Nazirut vow as raising the question of hafara. Okay? Can the husband do hafarat nidarim? So the first time we encounter it is where the husband has been a party to the neder, where the wife has based her neder on his. She became a nazirah along with him. So now can he do hafara? Okay? So, we're not going to work through the permutations. If we had more time, we would try working through some of the permutations, but for our purpose, it's just enough to note that that's the theme. Okay? Then Mishnah Daled gives us another wrinkle. If a woman takes a neder nazir and sets aside her sacrifices, designates the animals she's going to bring as sacrifices, and then the husband does hafara, so the neder has now been canceled, what happens to those sacrifices? Again, I'm not going to go through the Mishnah's answer for lack of time, but just the question is important to note. Okay, in other words, we're also seeing that the same way that Tractate Nidarim, okay, has a connection to Seder Nashim, so does Tractate Nazir. Okay, and the Mishnah connects Nazir to Neder in various ways, including the notion of hafara, and that in turn connects Tractate Nazir to the framework of Seder Nashim. The end of chapter 4 comes back once again to the same theme. A father can cause his son to be a Nazir, who madir et beno b'nazir. Because a father can take a vow on behalf of his son. Once again, we hear echoes of Heleni Hamalka, except that there she took the neder upon herself. She didn't take the neder she took the neder because of her son. Here the father is taking a neder on behalf of his son. His son will need to be a Nazir, but a woman cannot. So once again, man and woman, husband and wife, in this case, father and mother, but they don't play the same role. Okay? Fathers and mothers, this is, of course, standard in halachic literature. This is, of course, one of the areas that makes contemporary students of Mishnah squirm, okay, is, these very, let's call them essentialist differentiations between men and women, or perhaps it's just sociological, but again, it's not the same as the sociology that we live and that we feel comfortable in, but for understanding the Mishnah, we have to understand. Again, we're putting Nazirut into a family setting, and there's a very unique kind of notion. A father can impose Nazirut upon his son. A mother cannot. And here again, we think of a biblical figure,
Chana.
Excuse me?
Chana.
Chana, right? Chana, who did impose Nazirut or something akin to it upon her son, but the Mishnah, for whatever reason, assumes that that would not be halachically binding. Okay, and then we have the flip side, that a son can migaleach al nazirut aviv. Now, ligaleach we've mentioned, and it bears repeating, and it will be coming up in ensuing chapters. Ligaleach doesn't just mean to shave the head. Ligaleach means to bring the sacrifices that accompany the shaving of the head. So a man can use his father's korbanot. And if the father was a Nazir and died after having designated his sacrificial animals, his son can, as it were, inherit those animals and use them for his own Nazirut. There's some dispute in the Mishnah in exactly which case that works, but again, those are details we don't have time for. Okay, but a woman cannot. And we remember that a man inherits his father. A woman, as a general rule, does not inherit her father. Okay, so that would fit in as well with this very unusual kind of inheritance. So now we have, again, two mirror images. You have the father imposing the Nazirut upon the son, and the son using his father's sacrificial animals for his own Nazirut. Okay, which indicate a kind of father-son bond within the framework of Nazirut, and in both these cases, the women are excluded. The mother doesn't impose the nether upon her son. The daughter cannot bring her father's designated sacrifices for her own Nazirut. So basically, most of chapter 4 really gives us a lot of insight into Nazirut within the family as a factor in Nazirut, and Nazirut as something that defines certain kinds of relationships within the family. Okay.
Can I ask you something?
Yes, for sure.
With men, I mean, in those days, didn't men keep their hair long in general? Would it be so noticeable if somebody was a Nazir? And with women, if women covered their hair, how would it have been noticeable if they were a Nazirah?
Yeah, okay. Well, whether it would have been noticeable or not, I don't know. I don't think, what I think is really underlying your question is, to what extent is Nazirut a social statement? Okay, when you declare yourself to be a Nazir, so are you declaring to the world, look at me, I am a Nazir, okay? Or is a Nazir more of a private thing? You're a Nazir.
Is it reflective, or is it, right?
Right. So certainly from a halachic point of view, it doesn't have to be noticeable, okay? And if we say Stam Nazirut is 30 days, so 30 days is pretty normal period of time for taking a haircut with, and we have sources for it, not just today, but in the times of Chazal, 30 days would be a pretty normal period for taking a haircut. So so a Nazir who is a Nazir for only 30 days probably wouldn't have been that noticeable. For a woman, I'm sure it wouldn't have been noticeable. But that doesn't seem to really be the point. That might be an indication that the point of the Nazirut is more for the person himself and less for how the society relates to that person. Again, in the Tanakh, we don't always have that sense. In the Tanakh, you do have the sense that at least the famous Nazirim, like Shimshon, or like the Vakim Mibnechem Nazirim in Amos, those were probably known figures. People knew about them. Okay, in in our own day, we know of one famous Nazir, okay,
Right.
the disciple
Nazir
of Rav Kook,
Yerushalayim.
and he was
Right.
certainly well known to the general public as a Nazir. But of course, he was a lifetime Nazir who never cut his hair. So he would have stood out in a crowd for sure. Okay, but a 30-day Nazir, which is what the standard that the Mishnah is talking about, probably the public wouldn't know that much about it. Okay, it would probably be much more of a private affair. Okay, let's move on to chapter 5. Okay, okay, so now in chapter 5 opens with a machloket between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, and it's a bit surprising. This machloket doesn't really seem to have that much to do with Nazirut. Beit Shammai omrim hekdesh ta'ut hekdesh. Yeah, maybe we should get the text up here. Here we go. Okay, Beit Shammai omrim hekdesh ta'ut hekdesh. Beit Hillel omrim eino hekdesh. Ketzad amar shor shachor sheyitzeh mibeitei rishon harei hu hekdesh v'yatza lavan. Beit Shammai omrim hekdesh uBeit Hillel omrim eino hekdesh. Okay, so first let's just notice what's strange here. Is not saying anything about Nazir, saying something about hekdesh. And Beit Shammai says, even when you take the vow in error, it will still be hekdesh. Now, what's the error here? The error here is that there is a lack of correspondence between what the person actually uttered and what happened in reality. Because the person defined the animal that's supposed to be hekdesh in two ways. Okay, it's supposed to be a black ox, and it's supposed to be the first one out of the house, and that shall be hekdesh. Okay, and instead, the first ox out turned out to be white. Okay, so Beit Hillel says what we would intuitively think, which is what he said didn't happen. He said the black ox that comes out first, and the black ox wasn't the first one out. So therefore, no hekdesh. Didn't happen. And Beit Shammai, for some puzzling reason, thinks that would be hekdesh. That would be hekdesh. We have to think a bit about why Beit Shammai would say that. Okay, but perhaps perhaps before getting into why Beit Shammai would say that, let's think a little more about why would this Mishnah be in Tractate Nazir at all. So I think the natural thing to think in terms of what would be, maybe there's some kind of parallel case regarding the Nazir. What happens if a Nazir does a Nazirut b'ta'ut? Okay, he takes a vow of Nazirut, but he makes it conditional on something that doesn't actually take place. Okay, and let's say instead of saying the black ox that comes out first will be hekdesh, he would say when the black ox comes out first, I will be a Nazir. What would we say in that case? So perhaps the Mishnah wants to indicate that we would have the same dispute between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. So Do we actually have cases like that where a person takes a Nazirut vow in error? So let's look at Mishnah Dalid. Okay, Mishnah Dalid says, Misha nadar ba nazir v'alach la'avi et behemto u'mitza'a shenigneva. Okay, yeah, let's get it up on the screen here. Here we go. Mitza'a shenigneva im ad shelo nigneva behemto nazar hareza nazir. The im misha nigneva behemto nazar Eino Nazir. Okay, so a person takes a vow of Nazirut, and he's counting on a certain animal that he wants to designate for his Nazirut, right? He'll be able to designate it once he becomes a Nazir. But he has this animal in mind. So he takes a vow, I will be a Nazir. And he comes home and he wants to take that animal and set it aside in a separate place, because that animal will be designated for his Nazir sacrifices at the end of his Nazirut, and he discovers that the animal has been stolen. So what do we say? Okay, if the vow was taken when the animal was still there, then he will be a Nazir. But if the animal was stolen before he took the vow, then he will not be a Nazir. Why will he not be a Nazir?
Because it was dependent on him bringing that animal.
Okay, now he didn't specifically make it dependent, but it's understood. He was counting on it. We call that a ta'ut. Okay, now there's again a concept we had back in Masechet Nidarim. Okay, in Masechet Nidarim, the beginning of chapter 3, there were 4 kinds of Nidarim that the Chachamim say don't take place at all.
Don't
They
take,
go into
right.
effect.
Right.
Nidrei Zeruzin, Nidrei Havai, Nidrei Shkagot, Nidrei Onasim.
That was in the first Mishnah.
Now, these are basically Nidrei Ta'ut. You take a neder under false assumptions. And because the assumptions are false, we automatically cancel the neder. It doesn't go into effect. And this is basically the same kind of Nazirut. So once again, we're playing off of Tractate Nidarim, okay? But we're also referring to the concept of Ta'ut. Now, in Tractate Nidarim, we didn't find Beit Shammai arguing that Nidrei Ta'ut are Nidarim. Didn't find that. What about Nazirut? Nazirut of Ta'ut, the Mishnah says, wouldn't be valid. Would Beit Shammai agree with that? So I'd like to submit that the fact that chapter 5 opens with the concept of Hekdesh Ta'ut and a machloket between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai about Hekdesh Ta'ut might be in order to indicate to us that Beit Shammai would treat Nazirut in this case like Hekdesh and not like Neder. Okay, and let's think for a minute about why. Well, why would Nazirut perhaps be more like Hekdesh in this regard, more like Hekdesh than like Neder? Okay, Neder is not really making anything sacred. Neder is treating it as though it were sacred. We used the concept of hatpasa earlier. That's how neder works. Neder is the same way that I would refrain from eating or deriving benefit from something sacred.
That's a korban. That's a korban.
I will do the same thing with this secular item. This item is not sacred, but I will treat it as though it were. even though it really isn't sacred. But what about Nazirut? Does Nazirut make something sacred?
I don't think so.
Okay,
It makes something forbidden.
Okay, Nazirut carries with it prohibitions, but Nazirut also makes something sacred, namely the Nazir,
The
the
hair.
person, particularly the hair, but the person himself wearing the crown of hair is sacred. And that's why becoming defiled is such a problem, because he has sanctity that he has to maintain. And since the sanctity sort of locates itself in his hair, so when he becomes defiled, he has to shave off that hair and restart the Nazirut, right? And grow the hair long again before he shaves it off as sacred hair that will be offered, will be brought as a kind of offering. It's not exactly an offering, but it will be brought as a kind of offering. So I think that's the point of our chapters, to indicate that the neder of Nazir is in a way more similar to Hekdesh than it is to neder. Okay, we've had all kinds of comparisons between Nazir and neder. And now I think the Mishnah is comparing Nazir to Hekdesh. But this is all within the framework of Beit Shammai. See, Beit Hillel says Hekdesh Toad is also not Hekdesh. So Beit Hillel seems to be, I think, emphasizing the human element in sanctity. This, by the way, is a central notion in the thought of my teacher, Rabbi Soloveitchik, okay, that sanctity, with only two notable exceptions, sanctity is also always something that human beings have to create. Sanctity means that it's sanctified to God. It's dedicated to God. But the dedication to God has to be done by man. Man sanctifies. And then it becomes, as it were, part of God's province. It belongs to God in a certain sense. But only when man has dedicated it, has sanctified it. The two exceptions, by the way, are Shabbat and Bechor. Okay, and Rabbi Soloveitchik was very fond of pointing out that in both of those cases, there is a mitzvah for man to confer upon its sanctity. In other words, the divine sanctification is the bedrock foundation upon which man is then invited to add his own additional tier of sanctification, even in those two cases. And all the more so in every other kind of sanctity, including, interestingly, the sanctity of the temple, okay, is something man has to create. Man has to dedicate the area, man has to dedicate the building, he has to build and dedicate the structure, and then God will descend and imbue that with sanctity. But man has to produce it. Okay, so I think that's a very Beit Hillel conception. I think the Beit Shammai conception is that sanctity is something more objective, something more metaphysical. And if a person utters words of sanctification, then even if it turns out he was misled, he was mistaken, he based his statement on some kind of false premise, Beit Shammai will say, too bad. The words have their own power, regardless of whether they fully corresponded to what you intended. And Beit Hillel says no. The human component, meaning man has to control it. Man has to be fully aware of what he's saying. And if there's a ta'ut means there's a lack of correspondence between the human intent and the reality. that breaks the chain. That cannot be sanctified. Okay? But I think, in a way, Beit Shammai is more the point of what the Mishnah wants in bringing in the Hekdesh Ta'ut, to indicate to us that Nazir is not just a neder. Nazir is a neder that is closer to the temple service, to the sacrificial service, than neder is. Neder is, although it has a correlation with the sacrificial service, but it's a very different realm. It involves the secular life. It involves the world of every day, and you're treating something in that world as though it had this sanctity, even though it doesn't. But Nazir is real sanctity, and Nazir has a real temple tie-in. The hair of the Nazir ultimately will be brought to the temple and connected to the sacrificial offerings. And so in that regard, Nazir is a real intersection between neder and the sacrificial service. And we see that clearly, I think, in chapter 5. Okay, now
Excuse me, could you
yes.
give just, I always thought of Hekdesh as if you had a field and you made it Hekdesh to the Beis Hamikdash. You consecrated it. You're using it here in a totally different context.
Right.
Could you define it
Right.
differently
The
here?
Hekdesh divides into actually two different ways of dividing the realm of Hekdesh. I'll take one of them, which is the central one. There's Hekdesh Bedek Habayit, which means to consecrate any kind of property, okay, for the temple treasury. Okay, and what the temple treasury will generally do with that item is sell it, and someone will come and redeem it from Hekdesh, and the money will go into the temple treasury and they'll be able to use it. But often people wanted to consecrate items to Hekdesh, and Hekdesh would then, use them to help generate income. Okay, I think that's what you're thinking of mostly. But the other kind of Hekdesh is Kedushat Korbanot. Okay, and that is anything that will be used in the sacrificial service. That's also Hekdesh. Okay, so when you say Shor Shachor She'etzeh Mi Beiti Rishon Areu Hekdesh, you're probably talking about a korban.
Okay.
If it's an unblemished ox, then it can only be a korban. You're not allowed to dedicate what could potentially be a sacrificial animal to
For something else.
That's not allowed by halacha. So it's almost definitely referring to Kedushat Korbanot. Okay, now this case, Shor Shachor She'etzeh Mi Beiti Rishon. That should, again, remind us of a biblical story.
Yiftach.
Once again, Yiftach, right? Okay, so Yiftach, we've encountered him twice, towards the end of chapter 3, and now at the beginning of chapter 5. Okay, so we had certain elements of the Yiftach story in chapter 3. We had the inversion, the father-daughter as opposed to mother-son, the imposing something sacrificial or Naziritic from the father upon the daughter, as opposed to the mother taking the Nazirut upon herself because of the son. And here we have another aspect of it, the Ta'ud aspect of it. Yiftach made a serious error. Okay, and in fact, Chazal say his biggest error was not going to do Hatarat Nidarim, okay, which would have solved the whole problem. They blame his ego and perhaps the ego of Pinchas as well. Okay, have midrashim about that. Okay, but there was an error there, and nevertheless, there was sanctity. Maybe that's a source for Beit Shammai. Maybe that's why there's an echo here. See, Beit Shammai will say, Yiftach was locked into it. He says, what can I do? Okay, his daughter, he says, alas, what can I do? I've uttered the words, I can't do anything about it. Well, had Beit Hillel been there, they would have said, but that's not what you meant. That's not what you were thinking. It's a ta'ut. But Yiftach didn't think that way, and neither does Beit Shammai. Okay, so the echoes here of Yiftach again are, I think, very, very interesting and instructive. Okay, now I've said that the reason, perhaps, for Mishnah Aleph and Mishnah Bet, which continues the theme of Mishnah Aleph, is to get us to Mishnah Daled, which is talking about ta'ut of a Nazir, which the Mishnah just says flat out is, will disqualify the Nazirut, but I'm suggesting that perhaps the Mishnah is trying to indicate that that maybe Beit Shammai would disagree on that point. Okay, and if not, I think we need an explanation as to why not. But there's also an interesting linguistic bond between the first Mishnah and the fourth Mishnah, because the fourth Mishnah continues with V'zot ta'ut ta'a Nachum hamadi. Now notice there's a word play here. Who's making the ta'ut now?
Nachum Hamadi, a person.
Not the person who took the neder, but the sage who permitted the neder. The sage who told them they didn't have to observe their nazirut, right? It was the case that came up there. Okay, Nazirites were coming from the exile to sacrifice their offerings, and they found the temple destroyed, so they couldn't bring their offerings. So Nachum Hamadi said, if you had known the temple would be destroyed, would you have taken this vow? And they said not. So he said, forget it. No vow. But that was a mistake on his part. He claimed that they had made a mistake. He said, your Nazirut was a mistaken Nazirut because you were unaware that the temple was about to be destroyed. And the sages say, the mistake was not theirs. The mistake was his. Because their Nazirut was perfectly valid. Why? Because of the beginning of the Mishnah. The beginning of the Mishnah is the only time we disqualify the Nazirut is when the Neder Nazirut took place after the theft. He was unaware of the theft that had already taken place. That's called a ta'ut. That's a mistake. You were unaware of the actual circumstances. You were basing yourself on one reality, and the reality at that very time was other than what you assumed it to be. But if you took the neder nazirut and then came home and discovered that 5 minutes ago the animal was stolen, which is a half an hour after you took the neder, too late, you're locked in. And that is also something that is mentioned in Masechet Masechet Nidarim. Okay, in Masechet Nidarim, it's called Ein Potchin Ban Nolad. Okay, you cannot undo a neder based on future events. Because you can't say, had you known that in the future XYZ would happen, would you have taken the neder? That doesn't work. You can only say, had you known that at the time you took the neder, this and this was the case, that is a proper petach, but not something, okay? Now it's actually a bit more complicated. Something you could have foreseen would happen is not considered to be nolad. Okay, and that's generally how Petach works. Okay, you said, did you think about something that you certainly could have taken into account? You certainly could have taken into account that XYZ was what would have happened. Now, that's not an unforeseeable occurrence. Had you taken that into account, would you have taken that? That's a valid Petach.
An anticipated event.
Exactly. But destruction of the temple, that's not an anticipated event. Okay, so that's clearly nolad, and that is clearly something that wouldn't work, and that was his mistake. So we have like two tiers of mistakes. We have the mistake of the person who tries to become a Nazir, so his mistake will nullify the Nazirut, and we have the mistake of the sage who mistakenly thinks that they made a mistake. Okay, and they were mistaken about that. He was mistaken about that point because it really wasn't a mistake. Okay, so this, this kind of play on mistakes, I think, is a very, very interesting point. And the word ta'ut connects us again with Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, and I think reinforces the suggestion that in fact the Mishnah is bringing in Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel about Hekdesh in order to indicate that Nazir also should be seen in similar terms, not just Neder terms, but Hekdesh terms are appropriate when we're talking about the Nazir. Okay, let's take a look now at chapter 6. Okay, chapter 6 has in the opening Mishnah some very interesting word plays. Okay, so let's just look a bit at the introduction, and then we'll zero in on the word plays. Okay, 3 minim, interesting term. Minim usually means types or categories. Okay, here it means 3 type. He translates types of actions. There's 3 prohibitions. The Nazir has 3 prohibitions. Okay, the defilement, shaving the head, and anything that comes from a vine. Okay, any grape product, wine, etc. Okay. Okay, and then the Mishnah goes on to, in Mishnah 1, to give details about what kinds of grape products. Okay, now the Mishnah focuses on whether the amount that's prohibited is a revi'it or is a kazait, which is really a question as to whether you're focusing on the beverage, wine. That's basically what the Nazir is supposed to stay away from, is wine. Staying away from grapes and grape products is, is a kind of taking a step back. Okay, it's asus yagla Torah, building a fence around the Torah. But interestingly, in this case, it's the Torah building a fence around itself. Okay, some of the more contemporary scholars have written in the past 100 years or so, have written about this notion of the Torah sometimes building a fence around itself. Nazir is one good example. Another wonderful example is on Pesach. What fence did the Torah build around a prohibition? The Torah itself built it.
Chametz.
Chametz, not having it in your possession.
Right.
Not only should you not eat it, you shouldn't even have it in your possession. Okay, so that's
You
the
can't
Torah
see
building.
it. You can't see it. You can't own it.
Right. That's the Torah building a fence around the prohibition of chametz. Okay, so we would think that you basically view it more as a beverage. But interestingly, and therefore the amount, the Mishnah Rishonah says the amount is a revi'it. Rabbi Akiva, interestingly, says the shiur is a kazayit, meaning he's looking at the grape more than he is at the wine. But interestingly, he gives an interesting application of it. To soak the wine, okay, to soak the bread in the wine. Okay, now let's get the right thing here. Yeah. Let's here. Okay. Now Rabbi Akiva is picking up on this pasuk. Miyayin v'shechar yazir chometz yayin v'chometz shechar lo yishteh v'chol mishrat anavim lo yishteh. Mishrat. Rabbi Akiva is reading Mishrat Anavim. I don't think this is the simple reading. The plain sense reading is not to drink Mishrat Anavim. In other words, you take grapes, you soak them in water for a period of time, and then you get some kind of a beverage. You can't drink that beverage. It's not exactly wine. Wine is when you squeeze the grapes, the juice from the grapes. Here, it's just whatever seeps into the water from the grape, but that also you shouldn't drink. That seems to be the simple reading, and according to the Gemara, that's the reading of the sages who disagree with Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva takes Mishrat Anavim as meaning to take bread and soak it in the wine. Okay, and then if you eat a kazayit of that mixture, then you're chayav, even though you haven't had a revi'it of wine and you haven't had a kazayit of wine. You've had a kazayit of bread, but because the wine has seeped into the bread, so eating the bread has now become prohibited. This is one of the famous sugyot of kashrut. It writes a sugya called Heter Mitzaref L'Isur, which is discussed extensively in the Gemara, and it's related to a fundamental issue for the whole area of halakha of tarovot. It's based on this, but it's based on Rabbi Akiva's reading of the word Mishrat Anavim, to soak the bread in the wine rather than to soak the grapes in the water. But now we have an interesting wordplay, as I've said. Let's look at Mishnah Bet. Okay, get back to our Mishnah text. Here it is. Okay. Let's look at the next Mishnah. Mishnah Gimel, rather. Stam Nazirut Shloshim Yom. Okay, there's a textual question here about the word stam we won't go into. Okay, so Nazirut is 30 days, and then it talks about this is a new principle. The Torah tells us that there is stira, there is negating the days you've already observed for tum'ah. The Mishnah teaches there's also a negation for cutting the hair. Okay, why? For a different reason. You don't have to bring sacrifices at the end. You don't have to go through a period of purification. You don't have to bring sacrifices and restart the Nazirut. But what you do have to do is grow your hair. And whereas Tumah will soter the entire period that you've observed, cutting the hair will soter only 30 days. Why? Because the amount of hair you need to cut at the end of your Nazirut is 30 days. So even if you have a Nazirut of 100 days, okay, and after 80 days, let's say, you cut your hair, so then you have to afterwards observe another 30 days instead of another 20. Whereas if you had become defiled, you would have to shave off all of your hair and then observe another 100 days. The whole 80 days you observed would be nullified. Okay? So that's a new concept that the Mishnah creates. But what I want to focus on is that in addition to not shaving, the Mishnah raises questions. What about shampooing your hair or combing your hair? Okay? Because when you shampoo or comb your hair, you may be pulling hairs out. So it says, well, to wash your hair, to shampoo, or to separate the hair, that's okay, because most likely hairs will not fall out. But to comb your hair, where you will definitely be pulling out hairs, that's forbidden. That's the problem with combing your hair on Shabbat, is from this Mishnah. Rabbi Yishmael Omer lo yachof ba'adama. You have to be careful what kind of shampoo you use. They used to use like earth as a shampoo, as a cleanser, mipnei shemasheret et hase'ar, because it will cause the hair to fall out. Okay, now what I find interesting is the word masheret, which is a play on words with shara, mishrat. Okay, in other words, the Mishnah is using the same word for wine, the prohibition of wine and grapes, as it is for cutting the hair, for shaving the hair. Okay, now that word connection is not the only word connection. There's another word connection, but time is running out, so we'll leave that for next time. But you can look in the in Mishnayot Bet and Gimel for an additional word connection, between the wine prohibitions of Mishnah Aleph Bet and the hair cutting prohibition of Mishnah Gimel. Okay, and we'll make another 2 or 3 points about Perek Vav Bezrat Hashem next time. So I will wish you all Modim L'Simcha, Chag Sameach, and hope to see you all again next Sunday.
Thank
Modim
you.
Simcha. Thanks, Avie.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. This class will meet again at our, not this coming Sunday, April 28th, but our next regularly scheduled time on May 7th at 2:30 p.m. At 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you for learning. Modim L'Simcha, and have a good day. Bye, all.